On the evening of October 8th, 1871, the air across the upper Midwest was wrong. Settlers in Wisconsin and Michigan described it later. The sky had a yellow cast. The air was still and hot. Unseasonably hot for early October, temperatures in the 80s when it should have been in the 50s. The humidity was gone. Everything was dry. The forests, the fields, the wooden buildings in the lumber towns. Dry in a way that felt brittle, like the landscape was waiting for something. In the logging regions of northeastern Wisconsin, around the town of Peshtigo, men finishing their shifts at the sawmills noticed smoke. Not unusual. There were always fires in the slash, the debris fields left behind by logging operations. Branches, bark, sawdust, broken timber, piled in vast tangles across thousands of acres. The slash burned regularly, sometimes set intentionally by the lumber companies to clear land, sometimes ignited by sparks from locomotives or sawmills. The fires were part of the landscape. You smelled smoke, you saw haze. You ignored it and went about your work. But on the evening of October 8th, the smoke was thicker, and by nightfall, the wind had picked up. By 9 p.m., the town of Peshtigo, population 1,700, was surrounded by fire. Not a fire, fire. A wall of flame 100 feet high, moving through the forest faster than a man could run, driven by winds that were themselves created by the heat. The firestorm generated its own weather, pulling air toward itself with such force that trees were uprooted before the flames even reached them. The sound was described by survivors as a continuous roar, like a freight train or a waterfall, so loud you couldn't hear yourself scream. The fire consumed the town in less than an hour. Wooden buildings exploded into flame. Streets became rivers of fire. People ran for the river, the Peshtigo River, and threw themselves into the water. Some survived, standing chest-deep for hours while the town burned around them. Others drowned, pushed under by the panicking crowd. Some were boiled alive when the river itself heated from the radiant energy of the fire. By dawn on October 9th, Peshtigo was gone. The entire town. Every building. 1,200 people were dead. But Peshtigo was only the center of the disaster. The fire had burned across northeastern Wisconsin and upper Michigan, consuming an area estimated at over 2 million acres. That's 3,100 square miles, an area larger than the state of Delaware. The fire killed between 1,500 and 2,500 people, the deadliest wildfire in American history. And it was entirely preventable. Because the fuel that fed the fire, the slash and debris that covered the landscape, was the result of logging. This is the story of how an industry harvested a forest and left behind the conditions for catastrophe. How the pursuit of timber created a wasteland so flammable, it was waiting for a spark. And how, on one night in October, that spark arrived, and 2 million acres burned in a firestorm that reshaped the landscape and killed thousands. Let's go back and understand how the fuel was created. By 1870, the white pine forests of Wisconsin and Michigan were the center of the American logging industry. The forests of Maine and New York were largely cut over. The easy timber was gone. But the Great Lakes region had pine in unimaginable quantities. Forests that stretched for hundreds of miles, unbroken except for rivers and lakes. Trees 100 and 150 feet tall, trunks 3 and 4 feet across, white pine, red pine, hemlock, millions upon millions of board feet of timber. And the demand was insatiable. Chicago was booming. The Great Plains were being settled. Every town, every farm, every railroad needed lumber. The logging companies moved into Wisconsin and Michigan in force. By 1870, there were over 600 sawmills operating in Wisconsin alone. The towns of Marinette, Oconto, and Peshtigo were sawmill towns, their economies built entirely on cutting timber. The mills ran day and night, processing logs into dimensional lumber, shingles, and lath. The logging operations were industrial in scale. entire townships were clear-cut. The loggers took everything merchantable. Trees were felled, bucked into logs, and hauled to the rivers for the spring drive, or directly to the mills if they were close enough. But the loggers only took the trunk. The rest of the tree, the top, the branches, the bark, was left where it fell. This debris was called slash, and it covered the landscape. After a logging operation cleared a section of forest, what remained was not open ground. It was a tangle of debris, logs too twisted or rotten to mill, broken tops, branches 6 inches thick and 30 feet long, piles of bark stripped from the logs before transport, sawdust from portable mills, all of it dry, dead wood, left to bake in the sun. In some areas, the slash was 10 feet deep. You couldn't walk through it. You couldn't see the ground. It was a labyrinth of sharp, broken timber, covered in resin and pitch, as flammable as kindling soaked in kerosene. The lumber companies knew the slash was a fire hazard, but they didn't care. Cleaning it up would cost money and time. The wood had no value. It couldn't be sold. Hauling it away or burning it in a controlled manner would require labor and equipment that was better spent cutting more timber. So the slash was left. Thousands of acres of it. Tens of thousands of acres, covering the logged-over regions of Wisconsin and Michigan like a blanket of tinder. And the fires started. Small fires, usually. A spark from a locomotive, a campfire left unattended, lightning. The fires would burn through a section of slash, consume a few acres, and burn out when they hit a river or a patch of green timber. The settlers and the lumber companies accepted these fires as normal. You lived with smoke. You watched the horizon for flames. If a fire got too close, you evacuated. If it burned your property, you rebuilt. There was no organized firefighting, no equipment, no coordination. You dealt with fire the way you dealt with weather. It happened, you survived it, or you didn't. But 1871 was different. The summer had been dry, unusually dry. The rainfall across Wisconsin and Michigan from June through September was less than half of normal. The rivers were low. The wells were running dry. The forests were stressed. And the slash, which was always dry, was now desiccated. The moisture content in dead wood is usually 15 to 20%, even in dry conditions. In the fall of 1871, the moisture content in the slash was estimated to be below 10%. In some samples tested later, it was as low as 5%. For context, kiln-dried lumber, the kind used for furniture, is dried to about 8% moisture. The slash covering the Wisconsin and Michigan forests was as dry as kiln-dried wood. It would ignite from a spark and burn with explosive intensity. By early October, fires were burning across the region. Not a single fire, dozens of fires. Small blazes in the slash, smoldering in peat bogs, creeping through underbrush. The smoke was constant. Visibility was reduced to a few hundred yards in some areas. People went about their lives. The mills kept running, the loggers kept cutting, and the fires kept burning. On October 7th, the day before the disaster, the wind began to increase. Weather records from the period are sparse, but survivor accounts and later meteorological analysis suggest that a strong low-pressure system was moving across the Great Lakes, pulling warm, dry air from the south and generating sustained winds of 30 to 40 miles per hour, with gusts higher. In normal conditions, that kind of wind would be concerning. In a landscape covered with dry slash and dotted with active fires, it was a death sentence. The men who'd felled 30-story redwoods never thought their work would be remembered. The people who survived the Peshtigo fire never thought anyone would care. But you're still here. That tells me something about you. If you want to keep discovering the impossible and the tragic, the stories of what our ancestors built and what they destroyed, subscribe. This channel exists because people like you refuse to let history be forgotten. Let's make sure the lessons written in fire and ash are never lost. On the evening of October 8th, the scattered fires in the slash began to merge. Driven by the wind, pushed forward by convective currents created by the heat, the fires grew and connected. By 8 p.m., a firestorm was developing. A firestorm is not just a large fire. It's a fire that creates its own weather system. The heat generates massive updrafts, pulling in air from all directions with such force that the wind itself becomes part of the fire. The firestorm that hit Peshtigo and the surrounding region on the night of October 8th generated winds estimated at 80 to 100 miles per hour. Trees were snapped at the base, buildings were lifted off their foundations, and everything was burning. The fire moved through the forest at speeds estimated at 90 to 100 miles per hour in some areas, faster than a train, faster than a horse could run. Settlers in the path of the fire had no warning. The fire was over the horizon, then it was in front of them, then it was on top of them. There was no time to gather belongings, no time to hitch a wagon. You ran or you died. Families fled into the fields, into rivers, into wells. Some survived. Most didn't. The radiant heat from the firestorm was so intense that people caught in the open were killed before the flames reached them, their lungs seared by superheated air, their clothing ignited from the heat alone. Survivor accounts describe people bursting into flame while running, their hair and clothes igniting from the radiant heat of the approaching fire. In Peshtigo, the fire arrived from the west and south simultaneously. The town was built almost entirely of wood. The buildings were wooden, the sidewalks were wooden, the streets were covered in wood chips and sawdust from the mills. The entire town was fuel. When the fire hit, it didn't spread from building to building. The entire town ignited at once. The heat was so intense that witnesses reported seeing buildings explode, the wood flashing to flame in an instant. The residents ran. Some made it to the river. The Peshtigo River runs through the center of town, about 200 feet wide at that point. Hundreds of people jumped into the water, submerging themselves to escape the heat. But the river itself was not safe. The fire on both banks created a radiant heat environment that boiled the water near the edges. People standing in the shallows were scalded. Some drowned, pushed under by the panicking crowd. Some were struck by burning debris falling from the sky, logs and boards lifted by the wind and dropped into the river, still burning. The survivors who stayed in the river described the night as hell. The roar of the fire, the screams, the heat so intense you had to keep your face underwater, surfacing only to gasp for air that burned your throat. The smoke so thick you couldn't see. The water filled with people, some alive, some dead, floating past in the current. And above it all, the sky glowing red and orange, embers falling like snow, the entire world burning. By dawn, the fire had passed. The town of Peshtigo was gone. Ashes and foundations were all that remained. The survivors, standing in the river, numb and shivering, looked at where their homes had been and saw nothing. Just a flat expanse of white ash, broken by the stone chimneys that had survived the fire, standing alone like tombstones. But Peshtigo was only one town. The fire had burned across a front that stretched for over 100 miles. The towns of Sugarbush, Menachem, and Williamsonville were destroyed completely. No survivors from any of them. The town of Holland, Michigan, across Lake Michigan, was burned. The town of Manistee was partially destroyed. In total, at least a dozen towns and settlements were wiped out. The death toll will never be known exactly. Many of the dead were never identified. Entire families were killed together, with no one left to report them missing. The bodies that were recovered were often burned beyond recognition. Mass graves were dug in the days after the fire. Hundreds of bodies buried together with no markers. The area burned was staggering. Over 2 million acres. That's an area roughly 50 miles wide and 100 miles long. The fire burned through forests, cleared land, swamps, and towns. It jumped rivers. It burned through areas that had been logged and areas that were still standing timber. But the most intense burning, the areas where the fire was hottest and moved fastest, were the logged overlands, the slash fields. In areas where the forest was intact, the fire burned the canopy and the understory, but often left the larger trees standing, scorched but alive. In the slash fields, nothing survived. The fire consumed everything. The slash burned so hot it sterilized the soil. The heat penetrated into the ground, killing roots and seeds. After the fire, these areas were described as moonscapes, flat, gray, lifeless. Not a tree, not a stump, not a blade of grass. Just ash. The connection between the logging industry and the fire was immediate and obvious. The slash had provided the fuel. The logging railroads, with their spark-throwing locomotives, had likely provided the ignition. And the lumber company's refusal to clean up the slash or take any fire prevention measures had created the conditions for disaster. But there was no accountability, no investigation that led to charges, no changes in how the industry operated. The lumber companies expressed regret. They donated money to relief efforts. And then they went back to cutting timber. The slash piles kept growing. The fires kept starting. And the lesson, if there was one, was not learned. On the same night, October 8th, 1871, while the Peshtigo fire was burning, another fire was consuming Chicago. The Great Chicago Fire started in a barn and burned through the city, destroying over 3 square miles of buildings and killing an estimated 300 people. The Chicago Fire became famous. It's taught in schools, there are monuments, museums, entire histories dedicated to it. The Peshtigo Fire, which killed 5 times as many people and burned an area 1,000 times larger, is barely remembered. Why? Because Chicago was a major city. It had newspapers, reporters, national attention. The fire was documented, reported, and mythologized. Peshtigo was a lumber town in the wilderness. The people who died were loggers, mill workers, settlers. Their deaths were not considered nationally significant. The story was buried, literally and figuratively. But the survivors remembered. The accounts they left are harrowing. A man named William Ogden, who survived by standing in the Peshtigo River for 5 hours, described the fire as a tornado of fire. He said the wind was so strong it tore trees out of the ground and threw them through the air, already burning. He described people running into the river, their clothes on fire, and dying in the water from the heat. He described watching the town burn, the entire town, in less than an hour. Another survivor, a woman named Mary Williamson, described holding her children underwater in the river, keeping only their faces above the surface, while burning debris fell around them. She said the water near the shore was so hot she couldn't stand in it. She had to move to the deeper, colder water in the center of the channel. She lost one of her children in the chaos, swept away by the current. The body was never found. The aftermath was devastation. The burned areas were uninhabitable. The soil was sterile. The towns were gone. The survivors had nothing. No homes, no tools, no food. Relief efforts were organized, supplies sent in from Milwaukee and Chicago. But the relief was slow and inadequate. Many survivors left the region entirely, moving to cities or to other states. The population of northeastern Wisconsin dropped by thousands in the year following the fire. The lumber industry, after a brief pause, resumed operations. The mills were rebuilt, the logging continued, and the slash piles grew again. 1,200 people burned to death in Peshtigo. Another 1,000 died in the surrounding towns and settlements. They died because an industry cut timber and left the debris to dry and burn. They died because no one thought to clear the slash or manage the fire risk. They died because profit mattered more than safety. Nobody was filming when the fire hit. No one was there to document the terror, the panic, the families dying together in the flames. But we are now. If you believe their memory matters, if you think the people who were killed by industrial negligence deserve to be known, subscribe. You're helping make sure these victims are never forgotten. That's not just watching history, that's honoring it. The environmental impact of the fire was as catastrophic as the human toll. 2 million acres burned. The soil in many areas was so damaged by the heat that it took decades to recover. The forest did not come back the same. The white pine, which had dominated the pre-fire landscape, was largely replaced by aspen, birch, and scrub oak. These species are fast-growing and fire-adapted, but they don't produce the same quality of timber. The logging industry had destroyed the forest twice, once by cutting it, once by burning what was left. The economic impact was significant, but not fatal to the industry. The mills that survived or were rebuilt continued to operate. The timber that remained was still valuable, and the industry, as industries do, adapted. But the human communities never fully recovered. Towns that were destroyed were not rebuilt. The population of the region remained depressed for decades, and the memory of the fire became a scar, a story passed down through families, but rarely spoken of publicly. The meteorological conditions that created the firestorm are now understood. The dry summer had reduced fuel moisture to critical levels. The strong winds on October 8th provided the driving force, and the scattered fires already burning in the slash provided the ignition. When these three factors combined, the result was inevitable. Fire behavior experts who have studied the Peshtigo fire describe it as a worst-case scenario, a perfect alignment of fuel, weather, and ignition. The same conditions that created the 1871 fires have occurred since. In 1894, a similar fire burned over 400,000 acres in northern Minnesota, killing over 400 people in the town of Hinckley. In 1918, the Cloquet Fire in Minnesota killed over 450 people and burned 250,000 acres. Both fires were fueled by logging slash. Both were driven by dry conditions and high winds, and both could have been prevented with proper slash management. The logging industry eventually changed its practices, but not because of the fires. Slash management became standard in the mid-20th century, not for safety reasons, but for economic reasons. Controlled burns of slash reduced the risk of catastrophic fires that could destroy standing timber. Cleanup of debris opened land for replanting. Fire prevention became part of forest management, not because the companies cared about the workers or the settlers, but because uncontrolled fires destroyed inventory. The shift was driven by economics, not ethics. But the result was the same. The slash piles disappeared, the fire risk dropped, and the great firestorms of the logging era ended. The Peshtigo fire is commemorated today, but barely. There's a small museum in Peshtigo, run by volunteers, that tells the story. There's a mass grave in the Peshtigo Cemetery, where over 300 of the unidentified dead are buried. A simple stone marker notes the date and the number. But there's no national monument, no annual remembrance. The story has been largely forgotten outside of the local area. And that forgetting is itself a tragedy. Because the lesson of Peshtigo is not just about fire. It's about the cost of industrial practices that prioritize profit over safety. It's about the consequences of treating natural resources as infinite and the landscape as expendable. It's about the people, always the people, who pay the price. The survivors of the fire, those who stayed in the region, rebuilt their lives slowly. They cleared the burned land, they planted crops in the ash-enriched soil. They built new houses, simple structures of wood, because wood was still the only material available. And they lived with the memory. Children who survived the fire grew up and told the story to their children. Those children told their children. And now, 150 years later, there are still families in northeastern Wisconsin who trace their lineage to the survivors. The trauma was passed down, diluted by time, but not erased. Some of you have been here from the beginning. You're not just watching these stories, you're part of this. If you want to go deeper into the disasters that shaped America, the industrial catastrophes, the forgotten fires, the stories that textbooks skip over, join the membership. You'll get early access to videos before anyone else sees them. You'll get behind-the-scenes research, the archives, the sources, the process of uncovering these stories. And you'll be part of the tribe that keeps this history alive. The membership link is in the description.
Our members make it possible to dig into the past, to find the victims, the survivors, the lessons written in fire and blood. If you want to honor the legacy of the people who died in Peshtigo, the families who lost everything, the communities that were erased, the membership is waiting. The forest that burned in 1871 is gone. It will never come back. The old-growth white pine, the trees that had stood for 200 and 300 years, were cut or burned. What grew back is different, younger, smaller, less diverse. The landscape of northeastern Wisconsin and upper Michigan today is a mix of second-growth forest, farmland, and small towns. You can still find signs of the fire if you know where to look. Charred stumps buried in the soil, uncovered when a farmer plows a field. Foundations of buildings in the middle of the woods, miles from any current settlement. And the stories, passed down, half remembered, of the night the sky turned red and the world burned. The logging industry moved on. After the Wisconsin and Michigan forests were exhausted, the companies moved west to Minnesota, to the Pacific Northwest, to the redwood forests of California. The methods improved, the scale increased, but the fundamental relationship between industry and landscape remained the same. Extract the resource, leave the waste, move on when it's gone. The Peshtigo fire didn't change that. It was a disaster, a tragedy, a cautionary tale, but it was not a turning point. The industry learned to manage fire risk, eventually, but the broader lesson, the need for sustainable practices, was ignored for another century. The death toll from the Peshtigo fire is estimated at 1,500 to 2,500 people. The true number will never be known. Many of the dead were transient workers, loggers, and mill hands with no families, no records. They died and no one reported them missing. Their names are lost. But their deaths were real. They burned in the firestorm, alone or in groups, in the forests or in the towns. And they deserve to be remembered, not as statistics, but as people. People who lived in a time when industrial growth was valued above human life, when the landscape was seen as something to be conquered and consumed, when safety was a luxury that workers could not afford. The forest burned in one night, 2 million acres, an area larger than Delaware. The fire moved so fast that people had no time to escape. It burned so hot that it sterilized the soil. And it was fueled by the waste of an industry that cut the forest and left the debris to dry and burn. That's not a natural disaster. That's an industrial disaster. And it's a story that needs to be told, not to condemn the past, but to understand it, to see the cost of the choices that were made, to honor the people who paid that cost, and to remember that the infrastructure we depend on, the cities we live in, the wealth we inherit, were built on a foundation of exploitation and sacrifice. The logging industry cut the trees that built America, and in doing so, it created the conditions for one of the deadliest fires in history, the fire that cleared 2 million acres in one night and killed thousands of people whose names we will never know. That's the legacy, and it's written in ash.